So, a little while back, I did a Historic Murders of Portland episode, delving into the murder from 1903 of a farmer named Max Calof, who two robbers tried to steal money from his son that he ultimately didn't have on him. So, in their effort to escape, Max Calof was gunned down by these two robbers. Well, wouldn't you know it, I do a little bit more digging, find some new cases, and history repeated itself almost perfectly 32 years later in 1935. And that is the start of this new episode of Historic Murders of Portland. So the Calof family, they lived at First and Hall, what would today be regarded as Southwest First and Hall, which is directly in front of me. Intriguingly enough, start of 1935, a man named George Alexoff was running a store that just happened to be located at First and Hall. So obviously, while around the turn of the century this was more farmland, obviously much less commercialized, by 1935 it was more so commercialized. I guess somewhat like it is now. It's actually kind of open through here. There's like a building here, a building there, there's a building way off that direction. But again, right here, because this pathway is essentially Hall Street would be, and it would have crossed over and continued on that direction. So this is Hall and First. And, you know, again, they don't say exactly where, but either this corner, this corner, this corner, or this corner over here, I don't know which one, would be where George Alexoff's store was located. And on January 6th, 1935, two robbers came in and tried to rob his store. Very similar to what happened to Max Calof, this issue of two robbers being involved in both cases, 32 years apart, and they both happen at the exact same intersection here in Portland. And the sad tragedy of this is the robbers did gun down Alexoff. It appears the reason that happened is because he wasn't going to give in. He wasn't just going to give him all the money he had. And he decided to fight back, and it appears a shoot-off was at least on the verge of beginning here. And the reason they think this is what happened was it was a robbery gone wrong, where the robbers decided to actually use their weapons when Alexoff tried to fight back, as they discovered Alexoff's body dead, in a pool of blood in his store, and the gun that he kept there for protection, because it's, earlier days of Portland and you pretty much needed a gun if you were going to run your own business. The gun was found like right next to him, like he'd obviously gone for it, and maybe a shootout ensued, but more likely than not, he went for the gun and they immediately fired on him and he didn't have a chance. So he died here at this vicinity, this intersection, at the store that he was running here back in 1935. And this just felt like a case that was doomed to be left unsolved. There were lots of random, sketchy characters they picked up all through the first several decades of the 20th century in Portland. Robberies were a dime a dozen. They happened all over the place. There was all kinds of pickpockets and thieves roaming all over Portland. So, when someone got gunned down and it appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, it was kind of like pick and choose whoever you want. One of them probably did it, and if one of them didn't, well, you can probably pin it on him, was probably the attitude that was being utilized. And they nabbed a couple of guys on it, but couldn't quite nail it down to them. One of the guys that they busted said he'd been drunk pretty much since New Year's and had no idea what had been going on the last several days, so if he did do it, he had no memory, which sounds like a bunch of crap, but for some reason he was let off. The best shot they really had of catching the killer of George Alexoff was a guy named Frank Fisher, who had been in Portland at the time and was actually wanted for the robbery of another store that had happened within a couple hours of when Alexoff's place was robbed and he was killed. And what's interesting is it almost seemed like they were more interested in finding someone to put down for this other robbery where nobody died. But then in the case of George Alexoff, where he died in that robbery, it seemed like that was secondary. Maybe they felt like the two seemed to be connected. They happened so close to each other, so close at the same time. They probably thought that would be an easier case to get someone on. If they got them on that one, they'd get them for the Alexoff one. And Frank Fisher was their best bet. He was a guy that had been, reportedly had been in Portland at the time. He actually was busted, how much longer? It wasn't too long after Alexoff was killed, and he was actually busted in Sacramento because they were, the city of Portland was sending out, telegraphs and things, all over the place. Look out for, try to find these men who may have been possibly involved in crimes going on here. And he was actually seen randomly on the street in Sacramento by an officer who only recognized him because he'd arrested Fisher back in 1929, I think, for vagrancy. So like a couple years earlier, he'd busted this same guy, so we immediately recognized him and realized, oh crap, that's the guy they want back in Portland. So we arrested him and he was sent back to Portland. But again, there were two guys involved in this robbery. So if Fisher is a guy, there's still another guy to be attained. And that actually happened literally days later. A guy named Rex Duell, which that sounds like a douchebag, speed racer character. Rex Duell, let's ride. And he was busted in San Francisco and brought back to Portland. And apparently they had interest in him in relation to this other robbery that had happened too, a little bit more so than George Alexoff was. So they got two guys down in California, one in Sacramento, one in San Francisco, and brought them both back to Portland. And what's interesting is, from what I gathered in the information that I saw, apparently it was a new law. It was a new federal law that if you were wanted for prosecution and you fled across state lines, that was a federal crime. So suddenly you were put in the hands of the FBI. The federal government took hold of you. It was no longer just something that was going on in the city. And it's interesting because both these guys were wanted seemingly for the same stuff. But I never found anything that said Frank Fisher was busted on a federal charge for going across state lines, but Rex Duell was. The moment he got brought back to Portland, federal agents came and took him away because he had apparently violated this new law and thus had committed, a federal crime. But I never found anything about Frank Fisher that fell into that. And I'm like, well, there are two guys wanted for the same crime. They're both wanted, and they both fled from Oregon into California. So, I don't know. But what I do know is when all is said and done, neither of these guys went down for the crime of George Alexoff, whether they were involved or not. I mean, is it possible that federal government came down and took Rex Duell, so suddenly one of the possible, real suspects gets taken away and busted on another charge that may or may not be related? So all they had was Fisher, and all of a sudden they don't have the guys they need? Did they just not have what they needed on Fisher? Was Fisher able to prove an alibi? Was he able to prove he was somewhere else at the time this happened? I was never able to find any of that information. It seems once they busted Fisher and Duell, and then Duell got, busted for a federal beef and taken away by the federal government, it seems that's kind of where things just kind of petered out, and the case just was forgotten, and George Alexoff it just seemed like nobody was really that invested in solving this guy's murder. I mean, poor guy. He gets gunned down at his store. Yeah, maybe he should have, said, okay, take my money. It's not worth losing my life over, even though, people had, a lot of people own their own small businesses. They had pride in their businesses. They were a lot more willing to fight for what they had because a lot of them didn't have that much. They had their business and their families, and that was, it. But yeah, it just seemed nobody was really that invested in trying to solve this thing. And you fast forward ahead to March 1938. There's a guy, I never actually saw a name ascribed to him, but there's a guy who apparently lives on a houseboat that a local prowler, I mean, you want to trust when a prowler tries to give you information on a guy, but for some reason this prowler gave the authorities information about this mysterious guy who lived on a houseboat that law enforcement brought in relation to the George Alexoff murder. But once again, it's like they bring him in and then that's the end of the story. And I found one more tiny little article in relation to this, which showed me that obviously this mysterious houseboat guy, who I guess had admitted in the presence of this prowler that he'd been involved in a robbery gone wrong a few years before. Of course, George Alexoff's murder was 3 years earlier. It was definitely a robbery gone wrong. But that's really all they probably had to go on, and they probably didn't trust this prowler guy, so that didn't really go anywhere. But I found, the last article I found in relation to this was from 1939, so it's almost a year later. And obviously this houseboat, it was deemed an unsolved murder still, so obviously this houseboat guy was off the hook or whatever. But the last thing I found was from January 28th, 1939, just a little over 4 years after George Alexoff had died. His murder is still unsolved. Few workmen repairing the Morrison Bridge off that way. Not too far off that way, but off that direction, crossing the Willamette River between the east and west sides of Portland. They discovered a Colt 6-shooter, and I don't remember them definitively determining what kind of weapon specifically was probably used to kill George Alexoff, but they found what was reportedly a Colt 6-shooter between some timbers of the bridge, because this wouldn't have been the current day Morrison Bridge. This was the Morrison Bridge that like existed before that one, I think, because I guess this is 1939. I don't remember when the most recent incarnation of the Morrison Bridge was built, but this isn't the first one, and there's not really any wood timbers on it that the old one likely would have had, because they say the gun was found wedged in some timbers of the bridge, and police reportedly felt this was the gun used to kill George Alexoff. So if they felt that confident, unless they were just trying to save face for a murder that had gone 4 years without being solved, that seems like a pretty lofty thing to say, unless it was the same type of gun that was used to shoot George Alexoff, a Colt 6-shooter. So they may have found their murder weapon. To this day, we still don't know, because that is the last thing I ever found about the George Alexoff murder. You know, in a case where it seems like nobody really cared to solve it, it just kind of lingered and faded off, and there was just, they went through their suspects and none of them panned out. And it seemed from the beginning they were more invested in solving a weaker crime. And poor George Alexoff, I feel in the end they just didn't even really try with this guy. And so he died over 80 years ago, and as far as I can see, his murder is still unsolved to this day. It's an almost 85-year-old cold case. And it seems like people just really didn't try that hard. Unfortunately, that's sometimes the case, and sometimes these murders end up being unsolved, and that's where we're at with George Alexoff and his store right down the street at First and Hall. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much again for watching another episode in this series. I know I'm doing a lot of them. Remember to like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Hit up my Patreon if you want to help me that way. As always appreciated. And yeah, till next time. This has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland. Catch you next time.